All right, John Harris, welcome back to the Jay Burton Show. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me, Jay Burden. I appreciate it. And it's good to talk to you again.
Definitely. I was actually surprised how long it had been since you and I spoke when I was looking back through the episodes. It was over 110 episodes ago, which is kind of crazy to say. It
Wow.
doesn't feel like it's been that long. But yeah, I'm excited to have you back on, man.
I feel like it was like maybe a year ago.
Yeah, that makes. I'm doing the math in my head, and I realize I basically have done between 4 and 2 episodes a week since then. So you throw in a few holidays, and you get to about 100, right? But
Makes sense. Yeah.
yeah, I'm very much excited to have you back on. Obviously, check out the previous episode I did with John. I guess I was on your show as well. But could you just do a kind of a refresher on who you are and what you do for my audience?
Yeah. And I appreciate you having me on. I actually, everyone out there, I initiated this because I want to promote the 1607 project. And I haven't had a lot of people so far. I'm hoping that changes, want to talk about it. And I think it's a really important documentary and a book. There's a book that's connected to this. You go to 1607project.com, but I'm the director. And I suppose you could say producer of that. So I'm not interviewing it, but I conducted the interviews and did a lot of the editing and really it was actually my idea to begin with. So I was heavily involved. It's kind of a passion project, I suppose. And it flows out of what I do, which I suppose is a little bit nebulous and varied, but I write, I speak, I do podcasts, usually related to evangelical concerns, although that's changed a little bit and I broadened it to more political things. But I suppose I'm known for tracking down social justice incursions and influence in evangelicalism and exposing it, explaining it, refuting it. If you read Megan Basham's new book, which just made the New York Times bestseller list, you'll see my name at the end. And part of the reason for that, I think, is because Megan Basham was looking over some of my work to inspire what she was writing. So not trying to take credit for her work. Her work is her work, but just because people might recognize that what she's doing is similar to what I've been doing for a few years.
Well, fair enough. And I've sort of watched the release of her book at a distance. I haven't read it, but there's something interesting in you get the most flack when you're over the target. And
Right.
I've really become aware of her and her book because of the absolutely insane reaction to it.
Yeah, there's a meltdown over it. And it's not the first meltdown to happen, but this may end up being one of the biggest ones, if not the biggest, because of how popular the book is becoming. It's just desperation on the part of evangelical elites who are named. So, I've seen some meltdowns that were worse, but they were more concentrated in denominations or institutions. This seems like it's a broader, like all across evangelicalism, where they're trying to figure out ways to discredit her.
So let's get into the 1607 project.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
I assume that name is deliberate. So do you want to sort of explain, the genesis of this project and why you thought it was something worth doing?
Well, you've had, I think, Don Livingston on the program, and I'm trying to think, have you had Brian McClanahan on the program?
To quote Brian McClanahan, "I am too busy to go on your podcast." Direct quote. So I tried to get him on, but he is too busy.
Yeah, that's legitimate. That's Brian. It sounds like something he might say too. Okay, so Don Livingston at least has been on the podcast, and Don is he's a great guy. He's part of the Abbeville Institute. Abbeville Institute actually sponsored this particular documentary, and Brian was the one who put together the book. So Brian was in charge of the book. I was in charge of the documentary. And it started as an email thread with some of those guys. Clyde Wilson was on the thread. I don't remember. I think there's some other people that eventually got involved as well. But I just sent it out to, I think, him and Brian and Don and a guy named Boyd Cathy, I believe, was part of that. And I just said, I really think, and this was in 2020, I think, I said, I really think we ought to have a 1607 project, because at the end of 2020, if you remember, there was a response from conservatives, supposedly called the 1776 Commission, that the Trump administration put out. And it was mainly Claremont guys. And it was a propositional nation project, meaning they looked at America as this proposition of equality and liberty, freedom, but mostly equality, I suppose. And their thesis was that America has lived up to its promise in the civil rights movement of providing the kind of equality that America is supposed to provide. And we're good people. We're good people because we do tolerate all these different peoples within us. And they were refuting the 1619 Project because the 1619 Project said America is supposed to be this proposition, but we never really live up to it. And it's still out there. There's still this proposition of equality, but it seems like it's only the Black people or minorities. But I think it mainly focused on Black people, enslaved peoples that have taken that seriously, and they're the true Americans in that story. And it's up to the rest of us to conform ourselves to that. So both of them share in common this devotion to a proposition nation, not a nation of people and place, rootedness, language, culture, tradition, religion, but a common creed that's pretty nebulous and used to justify all kinds of things, including the invasion of Iraq and LGBTQ plus quote unquote rights. So I thought we ought to have something that contrasts with those. And the date that everyone seems to be missing is 1607. It's not 1776. It's not 1620. There was an attempt at that as well, doing a 1620 project. It's not 1619. It's 1607. That is when the first permanent English settlement was started at Jamestown. They brought with them their culture, their traditions, their music, everything I just talked about. And that's where America is truly born. It's the origin. So it's the headwaters, but it's also, we wanted to insert the message that it wasn't a proposition, certainly not at that point. And it was an adventure. It was, if you want to call it an experiment, I guess you can, but it was a very specific purpose that they were there for. And that was, yes, finding the resources in the New World, but it was forming a settlement, taking what they knew, the best of what they knew in England, and bringing it, and then mixing it with native cultures and eventually slave cultures and the just influences of the region. And that's where we really do get the United States. And so we highlight the influence of Virginia, which had an outside-sized influence up till Abraham Lincoln, really, and how they supplied presidents, their military tradition, their political tradition, their cuisine, their food, their music, all of it. And we show that that is what makes America unique. That's what makes us a people that we can look back and we can see mistakes like any people can, but we can also take a lot of pride in it. And I compare it to the way you might feel about your own family. Like, you don't look at your family and think like, the thing that makes us who we are is we're all committed to some principle. We're just really all brave in my family, to pick a noble principle. That may be true. That may be one of the characteristics of your family. Equality is even worse than that, right? Because at least bravery is a virtue. Equality is not necessarily even a virtue. But we don't take something and reduce it down to that, to some abstraction. We look at our family and we think of all kinds of things. It's a million different things. It's memories. It's our pastimes and how we use our leisure time. It's what we say to each other and our mannerisms, the way we look, the way we talk, the way we arrange our furniture. It's so many different things that makes a family unique. And when you walk in, it's the smells. You just have a place of belonging there, and you belong because that's where you're from. And we think a nation's the same way. And that's what the 1607 Project is about. So you can't plant it in another country and it doesn't sprout America in the deserts of Arabia because they have the proposition. It's unique to where we live and who we are and the experiences we've had. So
there are several things there. I think it's interesting, the sort of initial project, right? The 1776 initiative. What was it again? The exact words? Commission. Sorry, that's a close enough word, right? Well,
yeah, you're fine.
1776 commission, because there's sort of two common failings in conservatives located in that exact thing, right? Which is one, doing something kind of purely reactively, like, oh, you have a number, well, we have a number too, but also, right, and you address that very well in that monologue, right? The adopting a core premise of your enemy, right? It's the left in that has sort of talked past the sale, right? They've assumed that America is a propositional nation and it's not living up to that promise. The right kind of reflexively, or the conservatives will reflexively say, well, yes, it is a propositional nation, right? And in doing so, that they've sort of been swindled out of, shall we say, the kind of truly traditional understanding of their own nation. And I think that that's sort of an interesting case study of something you see often in the American conservative movement.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I look at the names on that. You had Larry Arnn and I think Carol Swain and Michael Anton, and it's a lot of people who are rock stars on the right. Intellectual rock stars. They appear on Fox News. They run institutions like the Claremont Institute or Hillsdale. And I get in trouble even for just saying these things, right? Because that's who we have. Those are our institutions, and I think some of those institutions do good. I'm not saying they don't. In fact, I appreciate even the three I just mentioned on a certain level. It's just that they've all bought into this, I think, poison pill that it. So you look at the 1776 Commission, and it's supposed to inspire you to be more patriotic. And I don't know if you watched President Trump when he was rolling it out. He wanted to have a monument garden, which is so Trump, to roll out the 1776 Commission report. And of course, the Biden administration came in and that all got canned. But he was going to have the greatest Americans in this garden. And notably missing from that list, of course, were anyone who had any affiliation with the Confederacy. So Robert E. Lee was not one of the greatest Americans in that list. And I knew he wouldn't be because he doesn't fit the proposition. That's the problem. They can, even though I don't think Thomas Jefferson does either, and they're going to realize, like, the logic doesn't hold. I think that the people who are most about representing the proposition nation in a quote unquote conservative light are the ones who will try to sweep all our baggage under a tiny corner labeled the South, and say that's the root of our problems, really, because they don't believe in the proposition nation somehow. They've had horrible things like slavery and segregation, ignoring the fact that the North has been engaged in these things, but they try to look at the South and they join the left. The left also sees the Bible Belt as their main enemy. And so it's very frustrating for me because you see the right employing the same exact strategy, because they both want to claim the proposition for themselves and say, no, real Americans are those who support our policies, and our policies are what lead to freedom and equality. And so it becomes this political tug of war, and it leads to these ridiculous ahistorical narratives that, the Democrats, they've always been the bad guys because they're the party of slavery and the Klan. And there's some kind of like trajectory from that to where we are today. And, maybe we can tease that out if you want. I don't think I should have to explain it probably for your audience. They probably know that's ridiculous, especially considering what the Republicans did to indigenous peoples out West and their, colonialism and the formation of the party, which was for the preservation of free white labor in the West. So it's like, it just makes us stupid when we try to do this. It's ideology driving the history. And I don't think that we would do this in any other circumstance, really. Like, we wouldn't do this with our families, for example, or our local communities as much. Like, we have a local town hall that has an exhibit on local history. And it's just presented as this is who we are. There's a pronoun, a plural pronoun in there. This is we, this is us. It's not, and we're proud of it, but it's not like we have to justify everything we've ever done because we are equality and everything we do that's good is equality. It's like, no, like we're a people in a certain place. We've been here for hundreds of years, and we're proud of the accomplishments of notable figures in our community and buildings that are historic that we think are beautiful, and wars that we took place in, and our veterans, and we have monuments to them. And like, that's how normal people over the course of history have thought about themselves. And we should probably get back to that, because that's what confers identity. Propositions don't.
Yeah, it's a very valid point. So why is Jamestown, 1607? Why is that the relevant point for where the story starts? Why not Plymouth Rock? I'll give you a straw man there.
Yeah, sure. No, that's not a straw man. That's a good question, actually, because I think Plymouth Rock does have significance. I'm actually the direct descendant of people who came to the United States from Plymouth Rock. I'm also a descendant of people who came to Pennsylvania and Virginia. But I think that number one, I already mentioned, it's the headwaters. It's earlier, right? So the Pilgrims were actually trying to get to Virginia. They weren't trying to get to Plymouth. A storm blew them off course. So they end up having this unique, amazing story, but they end up becoming just part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They get absorbed into that. So they're not actually as significant. And the Mayflower Compact is an important document, but it's not as significant, I would say, as even Virginia's first charter, or the fact that Virginians were the first to meet in an assembly, an elected assembly. And representative government was really born in Virginia. A lot of the things that we think of as quintessentially American were born in Virginia. And there's been part of the reason that we call this Virginia First, not just the 1607, but Brian McClanahan was adamant about this. 1607 Project, Virginia First, is because of Lyon Tyler's influence. Lyon Gardner Tyler was the grandson of President Tyler, and he was a historian in Virginia, and he made it a point to defend Virginia against what he found to be claims of northern supremacy, northeastern supremacy and hegemony, and the story that makes even people like Jefferson and Washington kind of like honorary New Englanders. And he wrote a little pamphlet called Virginia First. And in that particular pamphlet, we take quotes from it for this documentary and intersperse them throughout with a narrator. He makes a lot of really hard-hitting points about Virginia's outside influence and significance, supplying the majority of the presidents during her early period, including in the Articles of Confederation, not just the Constitution. The first Supreme Court justice, the military generals that have been effective have most of them have been, at least the famous ones, from Virginia. The American music all traces back to Virginia, uniquely American music. That's a super significant thing. I mean, you're thinking, everything from rock and roll to R&B to country music, that all traces to Virginia, not Massachusetts. And we make that argument in the documentary. A lot of the cuisines we think of as, like to put it this way, Europeans, when they're thinking of America, what do they think about? They think about hamburgers, right? They think about barbecue. They think about cowboys. They think about, there's certain things that are quintessentially and uniquely American, and many of those things are Southern. And the South really does form from Virginia. Virginia is the seedbed. So, even barbecue really has its origin. There's debates about this but did it come from South America? Where did it come from? But in America, it came from the South, and it came from slaves in Virginia. That would have been the earliest point. And they started smoking meat. And now that's known throughout the world as an American cuisine. So there's a lot of other things I could talk about in regards to this. Religion is another part of this as well. A lot of the famous preachers and what you think of when you think of American religion is really Virginian, whether it's or just Southern in general. Billy Graham was from North Carolina, but Jerry Falwell was from Virginia. Pat Robertson was from Virginia. I mean, that's the religious right in this country. Those are the founding fathers of the religious right, both from Virginia. So there's a lot more that could be said, but that's the reason, is because Massachusetts really was not as influential. They do have an influence. They did give us some things. Some of them aren't so good. Some of them are good. But I think when it comes to the culture and what confers identity, you're looking at Virginia more than anywhere else.
This is something that older generations have struggled with. It is the conception that the way history is taught in the U.S. has sort of recently become quote unquote political, right? That, when I was young, we were taught the true, objective truth, the literal historical facts.
Right.
And then at some point in the past, someone decided to make it political, right?
Right.
And, that's very clearly not the case. You're referencing, sort of an intellectual argument that has been going on since the founding of the country, right? What is the American tradition? And it obviously boiled over to the point that there were arms involved. And, I think that it's important to have this discussion, even for our non-American audience. And forgive me, if you will, sort of an extended anecdote. About a month and a half ago, I was lucky enough to be able to grab dinner with Ernst, the CEO of Afroforum, and Conscious Caracal, also named Ernst. It's apparently a common name there. And they were asking me questions about American history. I was asking them questions about the Boers, and one thing came up is that the experience of Boers in American Southern is actually quite similar. But also, they asked me the question of like, well, why do you have churches here with gay pride flags? Like that doesn't make sense. Because at least where they're from, if you are religious, you are conservative. If you're not, you just kind of get rid of the religion. What's the point anymore? And so I walked them through the sort of the Albion seed thesis, right? The idea that
Right.
there are different populations from both different places and social standings in England, and then also from the different parts of Europe, and those produced different cultures, and they brought different forms of religion with them. And particularly this dichotomy between the North and the South is certainly a cultural one. You could say it goes all the way back to the English Civil War, but also it is very much a religious one.
Mm-hmm.
And there are fundamental disagreements about everything that are very, very important to understand. And so when people talk about, and I count myself among this group, the real flaws with kind of state American ideology. You mentioned the idea of a propositional nation. We can find our others. Don't get me wrong. Some of that is present in all of American thought, but a lot of it comes from this kind of puritanical culture, right? And even non-Christian thinkers like Moldbug points this out. He refers to the sort of American empire as Massachusetts conquering the world. I was actually very recently in New England with George Bagby, right, who's been on my show a number of times. He's a good friend of mine, and we were walking around, sort of remarking about the fact that there really are no New Englanders left. That culture is really dead and gone. It's not alive anymore. There are churches that used to be full that are now art galleries and apartments and all that. So the kind of act that and even that population has been massively displaced by even what would have been called the quote unquote white ethnics 150 years ago, or the Irish, the Germans, the Poles, so on. But nonetheless, right, that kind of imperial culture, that kind of Puritan culture has become our whole government. And sorry, this is a massive rant from me, John. Feel free to respond however you see fit.
I agree with what you're saying, and I live in New York, and Connecticut border's like 40 minutes away. So I recognize a lot of the things that you're saying, but no, go on. It's a good rant, so I'll add in some thoughts when you're done.
Sure, but it's interesting that despite the fact that that ideology sort of just become the default ideology, the default theology, if you will, because they're sort of one and the same thing of the entire American state. And it's funny, because obviously, when you go through your documentary, which I highly recommend to anyone, it's linked in the description. You will see, footage of statues being torn down. And to me, it's incredibly funny to watch, for instance, the statue of Woodrow Wilson go down. A statue of these evil racist white men. And don't get me wrong, by the standards of our day, Woodrow Wilson was undoubtedly very racist. But there's sort of a subtle irony in the fact that these people don't recognize their own forefathers, right? That that's you 100 years ago. You would be Woodrow Wilson, and it also very much marries up to. It is kind of descendant from this idea, and you'll hear this phrase over and over again through the sort of the American experiment. This idea of building a city on the hill, right? Of building an exceptional nation that doesn't kind of work by the rules of other countries. And to me, I see that kind of hubris that I believe is leading to the fall of America as a country as being very much sourced in that kind of Northeast Puritan culture. I think that one of the things that gives the South an advantage is that we already had our hubristic fall, right? We picked a fight with an enemy we couldn't beat,
right,
and we had to suffer for it. And then I look at America as a nation afterwards, and there's a whole lot of pride without a fall. And sorry, I've been talking for 10 minutes now, but I'll
No,
give you
you're
a
good,
chance to
man.
respond.
I don't think you have. Has it really been 10?
Yeah,
So,
plus or minus.
uh, yeah, I'm trying to think where are we landing that? I guess just that there's this interpretation that we've all come to absorb that's not quite accurate. That is the superior. It really is a northeastern centric retelling of the American story, um, and it's it's almost like the Northeast died in a way, as you say, that they don't have recognizable culture, but in so dying, they redeemed the rest of us. They redeemed all, with and became a spirit that guides us, like Han, like Luke Skywalker's guided by Obi-Wan Kenobi or something to go into other countries and mess up their governments or something.
Well,
Um,
and the reason that I went on that long diatribe is just to say, the kind of conservative fallacy that everything recently became political
mm,
is
yeah.
very much not the case. That is a crack that runs from the very inception of the American project. I mean, these are fundamentally two incompatible visions of what it means to be an American, what it means to be a nation. And, obviously this was enough of an issue that there was a war fought over it. But the idea that the real disagreement is between liberals who believe as America is a propositional nation, but it needs to be less racist, and conservatives who believe America is a propositional nation that is sufficiently non-racist is the whole scope of the
Hmm.
debate. I-
Right.
that,
It's
that's
like
sort of
Tom
ignorant.
Woods' card, a 3x5 card, right, of acceptable opinion. It's so narrow.
Exactly.
And they're both, if you start talking about dividing the country up, right, they'll both oppose you just as fiercely. They'll say, no, we're supposed to look like this and have 50 states, and this is our temple of democracy over here. And we like, they're part of the same religion in a sense, but they're like the Sadducees and the Pharisees. They're like competing, um, you know, uh, clerics or something. And what I'm suggesting is actually outside of that. And we're starting to get back to that a little bit. I think, like JD Vance said, America's not just an idea, which was huge, I think. And then you see guys like Larry Arnn and Michael Anton trying to uh, accommodate that now somehow, and pretend as if they weren't part of the group that was ripping that down, which I find incredibly frustrating and disingenuous. I will obviously support them in supporting JD Vance. I just think that um, it, some of the same bad actors in my mind, at least on this issue, who are getting us to believe in this nonsense, are the ones that are now claiming that they're somewhat against it. And so I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that there is a change going on. But remarking on New England and versus the South, because I've lived in both places and have a lot of family in Mississippi. And but then my dad has been a pastor in New York since I was very young, and I've grown up here in most of my life. So what I've noticed is when it comes to history in the Northeast, they're very disconnected from it. They look at it as if they're looking at a foreign country, an inferior people group that they can put the microscope on and categorize and then dominate in some way. There's a superiority they feel once they've, I think, established themselves as the betters. But it's a novelty too. Like they look back and there's an interest, but it's an interest that you would have when you look at how Africans or Chinese or another people group, they do things differently, and you would look back and say, "Oh, that's so interesting. They did things differently in this area." In the South, there's much more of an ownership. These are our statues. These are our people. That's my grandfather. That's, um, there's a connection that does not exist. And so in the Northeast, they have taken some statues down, but it's not nearly like it was in the South. And I think part of that is the fact that in the Northeast, they don't care. They've forgotten and they don't care about their history. Uh, there's a slave cemetery down the street from me that no one knows about, hardly anyone. And there's a sign, an old sign that talks about how slaves used to scuttle the ferry across the Hudson River there. There was a statue to John Winthrop. There's a funny article I read it from like the 80s that talked about how like over time it just disappeared. Like I think it might still be there, but it like it's not in a prominent location anymore. They just kept like moving it, and no one cared about it, and no one repaired it. And I know Kirk Cameron did this documentary a few years ago called Monumental, where he talks about this big monument, and it's in the end of a cul-de-sac that no one knows about. And he did a whole documentary on it because it's supposed to be like the foundation of America and how we get back to what real America is. This monument will tell us, and no one cares. Whereas in the South, I think there has been more of a respect over time for those things, which is why they were targeted more, in part at least. And so, so I think Virginians and the Southerners in general have a longer memory. They have a more rootedness in who they are. There's a stronger identity and place of belonging, whereas there is in the Northeast somewhat of a neurotic nature I think people have, where they don't have a rootedness or a place of belonging. They have to be sufficient in themselves, and everything comes down to like, what have you accomplished, especially monetarily? Like what's the price tag you have on your name, and that becomes who you are. And they don't ask, like in the South, they say, where are you from? In the North, they say, what do you do? When they're greeting you. And so these are two different things. And I do think there is the legacy of the Puritans, at least what eventually was corrupted, Puritanism corrupted in that, for sure. And a culture like that just can't preserve itself. They're not going to be able to, because they have forgot who they were. So there's certain places where you'll see habits, and there's accents, and there's certain things, but it is discouraging. You go through these towns. My brother would vacation in Massachusetts, and I used to visit him when he would do it. And you go through these towns, and you're just like, I don't see children. There's no churches in operation. The ones that that do have buildings are either boarded up, or they're being used as a pub or something, like a restaurant, and usually like on the, that's in the more expensive areas. And then when you go through a city, it's like it's being just taken over by immigrant populations and so forth. So, so I agree with what you were saying, and now I've talked for 10 minutes, so I'll let you respond.
So, friend of the show, Dave Green, the Distributist, did a really interesting post on Twitter, which I cannot find, but it does exist, where he basically goes through the core theses of what people have called the dissident right, and their sort of broadly shared opinions sort of differentiate that group from mainstream conservatives. And one of them, and I'm going to horribly paraphrase it because I can't find it exactly, but I think it's an important point, is basically, one of these core premises is the current arrangement of human affairs is fundamentally unstable, and arrangements in the past were stable, right? They could pass on a culture from one generation to the next. And I think that that's actually quite an important test, for evaluating one culture against another. Right? Because say what you will, I mean, there are plenty of cultures I wouldn't want to live in, but they pass that core test, right? Of can you leave it alone for 3 generations, and will there still be people there, right?
Yeah.
It sounds stupid and it sounds simple, but obviously we can look around and see that is not a guarantee, right? That is not necessarily the case. And so when we look at a country like America that certainly has its flaws, and is in a position of dominance over much of the world, right? As patriotic Americans, we fundamentally have to look at this and say, like, all right, well, this is mine. I can't abandon it. It's like my family, right? In the same way you can't, just abandon your family.
Right.
But nonetheless, you have to look at this project and say, like, all right, well, this isn't working. There's something wrong here. And so, whenever I talk about the American South, I do occasionally get comments of people saying, like, okay, well, why does this matter? The war was, it was almost 200 years ago,
Right.
Blah, blah, blah. It's ancient history. It doesn't matter. But the reason it matters is fundamentally, what is the narrative of America? And so the whole reason, right, that you're creating this in response to the 1619 Project is a fundamental disagreement about what is the story of America. Right? Is the story of America a specific people in a specific land? Or is the story of America, this kind of like cartoonish history of, war crimes, violence, and genocide, and you need to feel ashamed for it and also give us money? Right? Like, that's a very fundamental question to answer.
Well, it's the emancipation narrative versus the sacrifice narrative too, which you I think see in the Trump versus Kamala campaigns, where the Democrats are constantly platforming, reminding us about, emphasizing these great leaps forward in the past of the country by essentially rebels, people who did not fit in and didn't want to fit in and wanted to make America something different. And that's the story the Democrats tell themselves. That is American history to them. And we're on our way to something greater where we'll eventually reach some form of equality. Whereas the Republicans, you notice in Trump's acceptance speech, he said at the end that we're a country that of settlers and pioneers and people who sacrificed tremendously and suffered deprivations and scaled mountains. And we did all these things to bring about the state of affairs we have now that we enjoy and the blessings that God has allowed, with God's help, we've been able to establish. And they're for us, they're not for other people. And that's a very different story than, and I think that does parallel the 1619 project and then what we're trying to do. The sad part to me, though, is that because I think Trump's instincts are there. Like, I don't think he's a Proposition Nation guy, but he's surrounded by those guys. And those are the guys who make up his cabinet. Those are the guys who are behind the 1776 commission. And who else is he going to have? There aren't many people in the positions that he would be aware of that would be able to do something like what we did. And so I think what we're doing is more close to the populism that Trump is tapping into than the 1776 commission. But you got these elites that I think it serves a purpose. I think this is cynical, and they would probably be mad if they heard me say it. But I do believe that the Proposition Nation is such a valuable tool if you're an administrative elite, because you can justify any policy position and you can do a moral play by saying that you are in favor of true, authentic Americanism, i.e. equality. Because, for example, you want women and men to be in the same, trans supposed men in the same restrooms at high schools. And that's America, because that's equality. And if you stand against it, you're not really American, because you're not for equality. It's so convenient. It's no matter what policy, if you just frame it that way, then you have a sledgehammer to beat your opposition down with. And so I don't think they're going to give it up that easily. That's why that is why I believe that it's as prominent as it is.
And that's a great point, right? This is a sledgehammer. I think one of the core problems that conservatives have is that I think for a lot of conservatives, with notable exceptions, they view politics as a facet of their life, not the end of their life. Right. So if you look at the pure demographics, right, conservatives are much more likely to have a small business, to have children, to say that family is extremely important to them. And so, don't get me wrong, like they're, and I'm sure, if you're at a roughly conservative church, this type of person, right? The well-meaning but literally insane Facebook boomer, right? Posting death threats to politicians and, AI photos of Trump riding a lion, right? It's sort of an archetype in red circles. But I can say, broadly speaking, that's the case. Whereas the thing that the left offers to many people is a surrogate religion, right? A xeno religion, as I called it in an article when I still wrote those. It fulfills that social role. It's not the same thing, obviously, but it's sort of like the Teflon in your pants, right? It tricks your body into thinking that that's a useful molecule for hormone replacement. It fits the same connector. It's not the same thing. And so I think that conservatives have a hard time realizing how important politics is to liberals. I think that's changing. But when we talk about, holding an idea purely as a stick to beat your enemies with, I think that's a tough idea for a lot of people to rationalize, right? That's sort of like genuine hatred. And, when I look at, the kind of current state of America, or state of the West more broadly, the thing that I'm realizing, this is actually something that I spoke about on your show, is that we're witnessing the death of, the post-war consensus, right? A time in which, culture was largely on the same page. The sort of median cultural ethos was not explicitly Christian, we'll say, but it was sort of like two steps removed, sort of a warmed over, kind of like a TV dinner version of American Protestantism, and most people could kind of accept that. Well, that's one that's been dead for a long time, and it sort of slowly crept through culture. We've seen this in the kind of like the gap, the culture war, right, as it's been raging. But it's effectively got to the point where, these two narratives about the nation, these two civic religions, if you will, are completely and totally mutually incompatible. It's what Schmidt would refer to as politics, right? When two people, their way of life is at risk, one from the other. And so, I think that, and again, many of these conservative types that you're friends with, that I'm friends with, are very well-meaning. When they call back to a depoliticized era, right, when they were kids. But the problem is that's gone. That's dead. You can't go back there. And so, these battles like the ones you're having over like what is the story of America really do matter. This isn't just sort of an ancillary detail.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. My dad is and my mom, both grew up in Los Angeles, and they're boomers. So they grew up at a time when it seemed like multiculturalism might kind of work because of a number of circumstances regarding living there at that time. And I don't know if it's, I think that area, it was more prevalent, but even in the United States as a whole during that Cold War era, there was this sense of national identity. We're not the communists. We believe in God. We have freedom here. They don't. They're terrible. They're an evil empire. And I think that common enemy did bring people together somewhat, and maybe gave them the illusion that it was possible, as long as they weren't that, people could bind themselves together. But that was never enough. It wasn't enough then, really. It's certainly not enough now. And once that common enemy's gone, then you feel it, I think, deeper. The left seems to try to constantly drum this up because they want some kind of a great enemy, whether it's Russia or if it's like, corporations that are exploiting the world and giving us climate change, supposedly. They want some great moral challenge that binds everyone together, all peoples, all places, and really what this is, if you think about it, and I think you said it earlier, this is a religion. This is what Christianity is supposed to produce on a universal level. Not the particular like Anglo Christianity or the Lutheran or these particular varieties, but like universal Christianity, the invisible church. They are going to be gathered around the throne of Christ, and it's going to be every tribe, tongue, and nation, as Revelation says. And so that's the common, the common enemy is sin. There is a spiritual struggle that's universal to all, but they want to find it in these other things, and they want their kingdom on earth. So there's a utopianism about it. And I think that the proposition nation itself, it really is that. It is that it is that kingdom of heaven, essentially, that we can never quite capture. It's always evading us. But there is this place that's so great that where equality is perfect, and no one has any need or hunger or problems, and you work hard, you get paid for it, and it's just a great world to live in. And this is an ideal, and it's mixed with the American dream and stuff, but it's this thing that I think both sides might have slightly different versions, but they think that they can realize it somehow. And 1607 Project is trying to say that life is good on the farm, where we don't have to have utopia, and we're not going to have utopia. There's going to be problems with this world. There's always will be in this temporal world. But we have some things that are worth celebrating and conserving. And we should focus on those things. And those are the kinds of things that are going to help get us through this life, because this life is hard. And that's why we need music and cuisine and religion and all the things that I think have helped our forefathers suffer deprivation to give us the blessings that we have now. We still need those things. We can't just dump them overboard. And it's not going to be dreams of utopia that will sustain us, especially elusive ones. And so we're in effect combating what we see as a civil religion. And trying to bring it back down to reality and show that it's better if we leave earth to earth and heaven to heaven. And we can order ourselves by the divine principles and so forth, but we are a unique people in a unique place, and God's blessed us uniquely, and we should celebrate particularity, not differences, perhaps.
Well, that's a valid point, and I want to actually get into the utopianism. Because when I mentioned that phrase, the city on a hill, that's a vital phrase, right? And you did as well there. Yeah. Because when we think about, okay, well, why do they hate the chuds, right? Which is sort of leftist talk for people like you and me, right? Why do they hate us? Right. Well, they have on paper reasons, right? Like we're more likely to vote for a Republican. That we might drive a vehicle they don't approve of. But when it really comes down to it, they really hate us because we're the ones preventing the realization of that ideal world, right? And if there were just less people like us, we could have, luxury gay space communism. You see this in, and I can never remember the name of it, but what was the name of that book about? Was it about Oklahoma? Is sort of this liberal economist looking at a state like Oklahoma or Kansas and saying like, oh, why does Kansas vote red? Going through and saying, oh, well, really it would make more sense for them to vote Democrats because they could get more corn subsidies. Entirely, missing the point of it. I realized that citing a book that I can remember none of the significant details nor the title is very poor podcasting, but I'll get a dozen comments, so that'll help. But actually, right, it's very similar to what we've seen in other utopian movements, right? Okay, why doesn't the Soviet economy work? Well, it's the wreckers, right? It's this invisible force of people out there sabotaging it, keeping it from happening. Well, why do Democrat cities, why are they look like Haiti? Well, it's redlining and institutional racism. It's this sort of like invisible force out there. That isn't my fault, of course. It's not me. It's really those chuds over there. They're the ones doing it. And so there's this sort of, drive to, in some cases, right, extermination, right? If you read the kind of more insane plans for, Reconstruction, it was literally, ethnic cleansing. Now, thankfully, that didn't happen. It would be a bad thing for that to happen if I even need to say that. But, that belief in the perfectibility of man, which is maybe a better way to phrase it, that belief that, if we could just get rid of the bad people, we could have it all. I mean, has very clearly, led to the most bloodshed in human history, right? We're sitting on, the tail end of the bloodiest 100-year span in human existence, and much of it driven by, that kind of, utopianism.
Yeah, especially if you take into account all the abortions. Yeah, so I think that what you said is 100% true. I'm totally tracking with it. I'm trying to think. I had a profound thought, and now it's left me for some reason. I'm trying to remember what you just said that was that sparked it.
So that's actually a point I want to get into, right?
that I forgot profound thoughts.
Yeah, exactly. Like, hey, John, why are you so bad?
Why am I forgetting my profound thoughts? Yeah.
But I think that there's an interesting theological connection to the political there, right?
Yeah, that actually sparks what I was going to say, but you'll say it.
Which is basically this idea of the perfectibility of man, right? That it is possible for man to become perfect. Well, why does that matter, right? Why is that more than just kind of an academic distinction that theologians, people who engage in theology, thank you, that's the word I'm going for, would argue about in sort of an academic setting?
Yeah, I think that in the South you have more orthodoxy, and this actually goes back a long way. This is at least late 1700s, early 1800s, when the federal period was really the time when you saw an acceleration of congregational churches in New England becoming Unitarian, and all the people with influence in that society were Unitarian overnight. And of course, it wasn't overnight, but the labels changed overnight. And this did freak the South out. They implemented apologetics curriculums in their colleges and encouraged parents to, sounds almost like today's, even though they didn't have like public schools in the same way we do, but today's like Moms for Liberty, like they wanted parents to go out and distribute apologetics material defending the authority of Scripture. This is before the slavery debates, really, or the debates over abolitionism, to be more accurate. And what eventually developed was you had the South who believed in the Trinity and the North who was Northeast, primarily Unitarian. And there have been some who I know, even at the time, contemporary observers who said that this translated into more of a federal arrangement in the South, and in the North, more of a centralizing tendency because of Unitarianism versus the Trinity. I don't know. I think that is a valuable insight, though, and a possibility. But the other thing is that the North gave up original sin, and even the evangelical denominations started soft pedaling it. And in the South, there has remained up until recently a very strong, and even it's still even more pronounced, but there's a strong belief in original sin, that man actually is flawed at a very deep level, needs Christ's redemption, and without that is essentially lost in sin. And the North believed in human perfectibility, that with innovation and science and man really did stand over even the revelation from God to judge it. And we're still dealing with this to some extent. You can actually look at a map, not just after an election, but just look at a map that shows a level of church attendance in the country. And you can see this playing itself out with some exceptions. I suppose, you have Utah and you have areas that are controlled by different, but in general, like in the Bible Belt, you're talking mostly Southern Baptists and Methodists and some Presbyterians and so forth. And they believe in original sin. And I do think that changes your politics or the way you approach politics quite a bit differently. You're not expecting utopia, for one thing. But for another thing, you realize that the people that you elect to these offices aren't angels. They're not going to they're not going to be able to usher in utopia, even if it was possible, because they are flawed themselves. And so the more that you can have a federal situation where you control your own life and have as much control over it as possible, and public morality is maintained so that people are able to manage that kind of responsibility, the better your society is going to be. Whereas in the North, it's more centralized. I saw this during COVID. It's more everyone needs to march in lockstep. A federal arrangement is something that they don't actually like because it means that people are sometimes coloring outside the lines, and that they might foil your plan. They might walk in without a mask or something, and then everyone gets sick. So they're afraid of that. And they want they feel more comfortable with more control, more government intervention, and when you eliminate original sin, you have more faith in your leaders that they can reach a godlike status and do things that really people aren't equipped to do.
I think we're coming up to time. We have really not a super chat question, more a comment someone paid me to read. Quality discussion. Well, thank you, Machiavelli Sucks to Go. I guilted him into paying for it, so I'm glad that he actually did it. Yeah, small crowd tonight. For those who want the curtain pulled back, the largest ever live stream event, which is Donald Trump and Elon Musk's interview on Twitter, is live right now, which seems to be why there is nobody here. So anyway, it's nonetheless, I'm glad to have all the ultras out, and again, glad to have you, John. But if people want to find more,
Jay, I didn't even know it was live until just now.
Oh shoot, I'm so sorry.
I would have totally shared this, so I'll share it afterward. So.
Oh, no worries, man. The audio release is bigger than the live show. This is fun, and occasionally someone says,
there's some really neat comments.
I didn't even see these. You'll get sucked into them. But anyway, man, if people want to find this documentary or more of your work, what's the best way for them to do that?
Oh, goodness. The documentary. So, yeah, for my work in the documentary, you can go to laststandstudios.org, and it has all the documentaries I've done there. And so that's also there. You can also go to johnharrispodcast.com and find out more about, I guess, my podcast, books, and where I'm going to be speaking, that kind of thing. Those would be the two websites. With the documentary, though, you can even just go to YouTube, type in 1607 Project. It will come right up.
Well, great. I highly recommend it. The guys at Abbeville do great work. It's worth your time. This is particularly so. I enjoy your podcast. So does my mother-in-law, which is a ringing endorsement. She doesn't listen to my show, but she tells me about yours.
Ah,
Uh, so she won't
that's
hear
pretty
this
funny.
anyway. But again, man, thank you so much for coming on. As far
Yeah.
as my stuff, you can find me on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. I've been flooded with new reviews, which I really do appreciate, mostly because you guys write really funny reviews. Some of them are completely incomprehensible to me, but I see a 5-star and I'm like, you know what? That means someone's enjoying it. So I do appreciate that. Check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. We've seen a lot of growth there, which has been fun. Lots of people there, which is good. And again, guys, remember to keep your head up. Lie can't last forever. Good night.